Thank you so much. It's always my pleasure to be at the Center for Latin American Studies, wherever we may actually be, and especially for you all to come and hear a little bit about this new book that I've just finished called Electing Peace. I'm going to briefly overview some of the claims, evidence, and contributions of the book before I turn a little bit to the case of Colombia and how that may actually apply today. Okay. And then very much looking forward to your questions and comments, so we'll leave plenty of time for that as well. As you may be aware, the death toll for civil conflicts dwarfs the death toll for interstate conflicts in the modern era. Since 1945, there have been about 5 times as many people killed as many combatants killed in intra-state wars compared to interstate wars. And in many cases, even when we can get a settlement in these civil conflicts, we have a relatively precarious settlement. Settlements have tended to fail on average, giving way to additional fighting. The 2011 World Development Report suggests that about 90% of all civil conflicts during the 2000s are actually recurrences of previous conflicts. The evidence in this book demonstrates that about 40% of the full settlements signed between 1975 and 2005 fail within 5 years of the end of the conflict. So constructing settlements that combatants will actually sign and sustain has been a really important question in ending conflict and securing peace. There are some settlements that hold, that's the good news, and this book identifies electoral participation provisions as a crucial component of why certain settlements succeed. So there is a set of common views about participatory elections. Thinking generally about elections, they may be somewhat surprising as a stabilizing feature in settlements to civil conflicts. Post-conflict elections have been a divisive issue. Combatants and democracy activists often push for elections when they're negotiating a settlement. Intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations have run many elections in post-conflict contexts where they're operating. But many studying post-conflict contexts actually suggest that elections may not increase the probability of peace in these post-conflict contexts, and particular types of elections can even reduce the chances for a stable settlement. I'm going to suggest that policymakers have, and academics alike, have focused on some difficult cases, including recently Afghanistan. And in doing so, they fail to account for certain important features of elections, of post-conflict elections. The post-conflict elections in Afghanistan in 2009, for example, were held during a pretty hasty process in which the incumbent government held polls, but without participation by the Taliban under some sort of peace agreement or settlement. So this case looks very different than many other post-conflict settlements, where we actually see a rebel party agreeing to participate in post-conflict elections, and then we see elections subsequently happening. I think that that dimension is something that's been missed by a lot of common research, and actually could suggest that there's a more positive take on some post-conflict elections. So electoral participation provisions are the central piece of this new book. They're defined in it as clauses in peace agreements in which both rebel groups and the government agree to form parties and participate in post-conflict elections. Post-conflict elections with electoral participation provisions reflect consensus by the opposing sides that they'll hold elections, that they'll agree to allow both sides to participate as political parties. And in doing so, they legalize a whole bunch of other rules around the actual process, the actual settlement. To make this a little bit more concrete, we can think about the FMLN in El Salvador. This is what this photograph is a photo from. In 1980, as many of you know, the leftist rebel group there initiated an armed campaign against the military, which was at times backed by the US. The UN eventually began facilitating peace negotiations in November 1989, following a request by the FMLN, and the government agreed to it in 1990, so that's when the negotiations actually began. And eventually there was a deal signed finalized deal signed in 1992, finalized a set of accords that were negotiated over those 2 years. One of the major provisions in the agreement reads that it will allow for, quote, the legalization of FMLN as a political party through the adoption of a legislative decree to that end, in Spanish, of course. The international community strongly backed the agreement, though the UN peacekeeping mission that was sent was very small, but there was a large electoral mission around the subsequent 1994 elections, which were the first ones in which the FMLN participated. Electoral participation provisions have been included in many settlements negotiated to some of the most difficult conflicts from right after the end of the Cold War, thinking about the FMLN in El Salvador, also Bosnia-Herzegovina, many of these other cases, Mozambique, Angola in that period, all the way through to cases like Burundi with their 2000 and 2004 negotiations. These are very different countries. Some of them have already been running elections, others have not been running elections, but they all feature this provisions to allow the rebel group to participate as a political party. So the two main takeaway points, I think, from the evidence in the book is that settlements are increasingly based on these provisions that establish former rebel groups as political parties. They are present in almost half of all settlements. And compared to other settlements, having these provisions in a peace agreement is associated with an 80% increase in the chance that peace will stick in that agreement. So these are electoral participation provisions. These are the clauses that allow the rebel groups to participate in post-conflict elections. Yes, and EPPs occurs throughout the slides, so it's a good clarifying question to get out now. The results emerged from an examination of 122 peace agreements between 1975 and 2005, and the 388 civil conflicts that take place in those years. The book also looks in depth at the cases of Guatemala and El Salvador, as well as a set of other cases that occur at the end of the Cold War. So what's the theory? The book develops a theory that electoral participation provisions facilitate external engagement, that is international engagement by the international community, to monitor and enforce compliance by both sides with the implementation of a peace agreement. In doing so, I argue that they produce less precarious settlements and more enduring peace. So thinking about peacekeeping, what I'm really suggesting is that electoral participation provisions are a way of enabling and facilitating peacekeeping, among other functions. Peacekeeping has been a puzzling issue if one thinks carefully about its costs. Most have painted the mechanism by which peacekeeping works as military coercion, so that armed forces would actually go in and punish violations of implementation of a settlement with force. But in many cases, military coercion is going to be very costly for peacekeepers, and many peacekeepers are in fact not even mandated to carry out those functions. So what I'm going to argue is that a lot of peacekeepers actually engage through non-military mechanisms, and in particular engaging around post-conflict elections is a way to enforce these settlements without using military coercion. Okay, so let's think through that just a little bit, as in the case of El Salvador. So what we have here is a caravan on the left of FMLN fighters. They are going toward a demobilization point where they're going to turn in their weapons. And on the right-hand side, what you have is a UN vehicle, right, a SUV with just a couple of monitors in it. This is not uncommon for post-conflict peacekeeping missions to look like this. How does this UN mission work? If this is the mechanism through which we're stabilizing these states, how is it that we actually overcome some of the problems in post-conflict contexts? Many people have thought a lot about post-conflict contexts, are especially concerned about what we call commitment problems. So commitment problems are cases in which combatants can identify a deal that benefits both of them. So if we stop fighting and actually agree to the terms of the bargain, we'll both be better off than if we continue fighting and destroy resources and have combatant deaths and non-combatant deaths. But even if we agree to that bargain, one or the other of us during implementation may become stronger, and it will then have an incentive to renege on the deal, to go back on the terms that it agreed to. If one side or the other is concerned that its opponent will renege on the deal at some point during the implementation, it may refuse to sign the deal altogether, or it may very quickly revert to force when it sees any indication that its opponent actually isn't following through on the terms of the agreement. So these fears are what we refer to as commitment problems, credible commitment problems. And they can be resolved by, in some way, increasing the benefits of staying committed to compliance throughout the implementation period. And that is really what I'm going to argue peacekeepers are able to do. So a typical solution might be to monitor the context and see whether either side is failing to comply with the peacekeeping deal. And then if they are, rather than using the personnel, arms, and military materiel used to guarantee a settlement by punishing with force, actually use something like withdrawing development aid, development assistance, party funds from each side until they start complying again with the deal. So the book offers a different conception of enforcement in which external actors, without using force, are actually able to change the cost calculation for the former combatant groups. Punishment is only greater than the resources that the other side would be able to grab by failing to comply with the agreement, and so it need not be a huge amount of resources that you're providing in these moments. In the case of El Salvador, the UN and especially the US leveraged the incentives that they could offer, especially foreign aid, which was actually frozen during moments of implementation, as I'll discuss in just a few minutes, in response to bad behavior on either the government or the rebel side, the government side in this particular case. And the elections in particular are important moments around which we can solidify this external engagement. Okay, so why are electoral participation provisions so important in enabling this low cost and therefore relatively credible mechanism of external involvement? The provisions that establish these cycles culminate in these moments of power distribution, elections, where we have the government and the rebel group competing for a set number of seats, from which they'll then be able to influence policy. In the moments leading up to this, we have a very specific set of benchmarks and milestones that are made public and that are very regular about who can participate, how they participate, and what happens when one side or the other wins. And so these are the actual rules here that establish the way in which we're going to set up a power sharing deal between the rebel group and the government. Elections, however, are also very useful for another reason, and that has to do with the systemic changes that began at the end of the Cold War. So not only are elections useful because of their features, because they inherently require you to specify these terms before you actually start an electoral cycle, but also because, at least since 1989, elections are a moment at which the international community tends to engage in conflicts, in post-conflict contexts, to provide monitoring and to provide funding for political parties and for the political process in particular. So external actors can use democracy promotion programs to provide international election observation and other conditional incentives, especially military assistance in the form of foreign aid and assistance to political parties in these moments. External engagement through electoral participation provisions is not going to be possible in all post-conflict settings. For example, there are some cases in which there's a pre-existing special or strategic relationship between a potential enforcer and one of the sides in the conflict, usually the government side. And so an unbiased enforcement in that case may not be credible. But there are many cases in which a sort of substantial external involvement around elections to enforce the power sharing deal between the government and the militant group really are credible. So let me show you a little bit of evidence on this. The book is laid out as follows. There's an introductory chapter, theory chapter, and a chapter that develops this notion of how elections have changed over time, and in particular since 1989, that we see the international community really involved in elections, and especially post-conflict elections in the way that I've just laid out. Then what I want to walk through today are just a few pieces of evidence from the empirical chapters. The first looks at the causes of electoral participation provisions, and the second looks at the consequences of electoral participation provisions. So we'll start with the causes. The first set of observable implications from the theory relate to the idea that provisions for the rebel group and the government to participate electorally is likely to increase once combatants expect that international actors will engage in a way that is not partisan in the conflict to monitor and enforce compliance after the deal is struck. So first indicator of nonpartisanship, or at least less partisanship in many cases, is the end of the Cold War. So what you can see here are the bars that are not filled in are peace agreements, and the bars that are filled in are peace agreements that contain these provisions for electoral participation provisions. That is, there are certainly fewer peace agreements before the end of the Cold War in general, but also none of those peace agreements have electoral participation provisions, whereas they exist in about half of all cases after the end of the Cold War. This is a statistically significant effect, even though there are fewer cases here. It is a statistically significant effect between the Cold War period and the post-Cold War period. There are, of course, lots of other things that could be happening with the end of the Cold War, right? And so we might want to think about other ways to measure this relatively nonpartisan engagement by the international community in these conflicts. And so I look at a couple of these. The first you can just see is this Cold War effect. The second is looking at how many states in the region in the past year received some form of election observation. When we talk about election observation, we mean a foreign mission sent into a country right around the election period to watch the polling process and report back on it. These are often highly publicized in the media, and in post-conflict context, many of these take place through the UN, but these could be missions from the Carter Center, other intergovernmental organizations as well. What we see are that in cases where we have high rates of regional electoral observation, so a lot of states in the region in the past year received this type of observation, we see pretty high rates of participation provisions. About 59% of the cases receive these electoral participation provisions. In regions where we have low rates of regional election observation, we see much lower rates of these electoral participation provisions. The same goes with democracy aid. We provide, US and other Western states provide democracy aid differently across different regions. And in regions where we provide pretty high rates of democracy aid as a percentage of all development assistance, we see higher rates of electoral participation provisions. There's a lot of other evidence in the chapter talking about exactly when we see these particular participation provisions, but I think here a case may also be of interest. So the case that I want to say just a little bit about is Guatemala. So both Guatemala and El Salvador, as the Cold War ends, begin to think of the international community as a more neutral force in securing their peace process. In both cases, the U.S. had intervened on the government side at periods during the conflict. In Guatemala, the civil war was especially brutal between 1981 and 1983, for example. We see this U.S.-backed government countering leftist guerrillas with tactics that include genocidal campaigns in some of their regions where they have their most support, especially indigenous regions in Guatemala. There were tens of thousands killed during the fighting in the 1980s. So the URNG, the rebel group in this particular case, is pretty weak even by 1984, but it's able to continue engaging the government in a lopsided conflict through 1996. What convinced the Guatemalan rebel group to actually agree to a peace deal there were multiple factors, of course. Some of them had to do with whether or not there was a bargain that would actually benefit the URNG on the table. But another dimension of this was the international community convincing the rebels in this case that they would actually serve as a relatively nonpartisan monitor and enforcer of compliance in this case. And there was a particular moment that was pointed to in some of the work that I've done. So in 1993, there was an attempt by the president at a self-coup where he wanted to suspend the Constitution and dissolve the other branches of government. The international community did not back the government in that case and actually reacted really strongly to the auto coup, demonstrating pretty definitively that it would punish either side that actually violated the rules, the democratic rules in Guatemala. So there's some nice quotes on this as the U.S. actually freezes aid in the aftermath of this auto coup, including State Department spokesman who summed this up by saying, "There's no justification for resorting to non-democratic means in Guatemala." Subsequently, in some of my interview work with URNG members, they point to the importance of these brother countries coming in and actually helping them to secure their peace agreement, including the United States, which I think is pretty surprising in this case, given how strongly they had backed the government during the Cold War, and it's only after the Cold War ends that they're seen as this more nonpartisan actor. The State Department memos from this time say that they had to be very careful not to damage their reputation as an honest broker, quote, honest broker in the peace process. So they're definitely aware of their role in this sort of nonpartisan backing position that they're put in at the end of the Cold War. Okay. Happy to talk much more about the causes of electoral participation provisions in the Q&A, but what I want to get to is the second set of implications from electoral engagement theory, the theory that I call my theory in this book. The second set of implications suggests that when we have electoral participation provisions included in the settlement, they should actually improve the chance of a stable conflict resolution mechanism. So in this case, a stable settlement. And so what this figure shows is the survival of peace. And so what you would like is to have 100% survival of peace. So you would like a flat line along the top of this graph here. And what you can see is that when we have electoral participation provisions in the peace agreement, this dotted line, that drops down from 100% peace less than if you don't have electoral participation provisions. That is, you're less likely to see conflict recurrence in settlements that have electoral participation provisions than in settlements that don't. Moreover, and really interesting, this effect only persists where you actually have this type of external engagement. So I talked about the mechanism being important not just to have these elections, but also to have these relatively nonpartisan international actors who are actually willing to be on the ground to monitor and enforce the terms of the peace agreement. And what you might be able to see here are these bars showing the distribution of the data across the x-axis, but what this is the regional election observation distribution. So here are regions in which very few elections are monitored in the past year. So, on the left-hand side of the chart, 0% of the elections in that region were monitored in a particular year. Here on the right-hand side of the chart, 100% of these elections were monitored in the past year. And what you can see is the dotted line, again, is the case with electoral participation provisions. And we're looking at conflict recurrence here. So what we can see is that conflict recurrence drops off as we have these higher rates of electoral participation provisions, as well as these higher rates of regional election observation. So it's the two factors combined, having these EPPs, but also having this type of international engagement expected in these countries that actually increases the probability of peace, or as this chart shows, decreases the probability that we'll see conflict recurrence in these cases. So just to make that a little bit more concrete, let me come back to the case of El Salvador, which I was telling you a little bit about. And there are a couple of examples I think that are pretty striking in this case that actually show you how this mechanism might be working. So in El Salvador, for instance, the government failed to expedite the issuing of voter registration cards for more than a quarter of the eligible population who did not yet have voter registration cards. These tended to be FMLN supporters, leftists who had not participated in past elections. And so by freezing their registration, you were essentially taking power away from the leftist voters and moving it more toward the center and the right. Once this issue was brought to the attention of the U.S., Congress actually froze $70 million in U.S. economic support funds in August 1993 in order to encourage the government to speed up its registration of these voter cards. And this was a moment in which the UN was actually deeply involved in figuring out and monitoring the extent of the problem. So actually finding out how many people were not getting registered at that moment and showing that there was really going to be an imbalance in power compared to what had been agreed to. The aid freeze was enough to increase the registration of voters, and it eventually led the UN to declare by October, just before the elections, that 90% of potential voters had actually, or would actually be registered by the November deadline. So a huge turnaround in government policy based on this external observation and this freezing of aid. There are lots of other examples. Another noteworthy one was an attempt by the government to move the polling stations from a set of FMLN strongholds into a department capital. The government claimed that it was a security concern to have these polling stations in the village in these villages, and that they needed to move it to the capital. But it would have also meant that voters in those villages would have to walk half a day to get to a polling station, right? So increasing the burden on them and decreasing the probability that they would actually turn out to vote. The UN again examined this claim, challenged it, and said that there wasn't evidence for this, and in fact that the UN would be happy to provide security and logistical support around those polling stations. There are lots of other examples in the book, but I think this sort of demonstrates the way in which there's a lot of subtle manipulation, especially by the incumbent, of these power sharing deals down the road. And it can be a little bit easier to pick up and to punish, especially for the international community, if these are around elections, rather than simply something like distributing ministries or cabinet positions among rebels and governments, where there's no sort of mechanism or moment at which you can actually check on how well they're doing. Okay, so there's the outline. We finally are down at the conclusion here about securing peace. So I think there are a couple of important points that I want to emphasize here. In my opinion, I think there are a couple of contributions that the evidence from the book makes. So overall, it offers a mechanism for engaging external actors in a way that is not what we've often thought about peacekeepers doing. So it is a way that is not using kinetic force, but rather using these conditional incentives, such as aid around elections. So it suggests that there's sort of a broader involvement of the international community that's important in stabilizing these contexts. And it also contrasts prevailing pessimism about post-conflict elections, right? There may be some post-conflict elections that really are not helpful in the context of peace, but this particular set of post-conflict elections, those that are created by rebel groups and governments agreeing to participate in post-conflict elections as part of a settlement, seem to actually be beneficial to peace between those parties. There is something to flag here, which is that electoral participation provisions can help to overcome these persistent obstacles to peace between the two sides, but in doing so, they may also involve trading dimensions of democracy for stability. So some of these deals, for example, set up ethnic quotas, where the government and the rebel group then know about how many seats they're going to receive because they are ethnic quotas distributing the seats in the legislature. There are cases of this in Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, as well as Burundi. In other cases, it may just be that there's some sort of status quo bias left in place. Elizabeth Wood has some excellent work on this, thinking about the case of El Salvador and also South Africa. Right? So there may be ways in which the deal struck between the rebel group and the government doesn't necessarily open the elections very much to voters, to average citizens, and to their participation. And so I suggest that there's this possibility of a stability democracy trade-off in these contexts. You know, I think that there are some policy implications that already emerge from this. First, if correct, the theory suggests that policymakers need not shy away from all post-conflict elections. There are certain post-conflict elections that may actually be useful. Second, that external actors actually do need to monitor and sanction during these processes based on compliance with the deal. So it may actually be useful to explicitly condition benefits like democracy aid or party funds on compliance with these electoral participation provisions and the other provisions in the deal. And finally, that in order to get nonpartisan actors in more cases that are able to enforce these deals, may be useful to think about strengthening intergovernmental organizations, especially if we can get opposing sides signed on to back these deals in cases where there may be concern about partisanship. Okay, so I think that there is a broader research agenda. I'm just going to leave this slide up for a moment to suggest this, but that there are lots of domestic deals, especially in contexts of transition to democracy, in which the governments and their opponents must actually overcome some of these commitment problems. I suggest that there are mechanisms like these conditional incentives around these moments of monitoring that may actually be useful in cases beyond the post-conflict context. I'm really happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. But especially for this audience, I want to get to this last slide, which is about Colombia. So this book has been thought about a lot in the context of Colombia. I've spent a lot of time in Colombia, and the case that motivated a lot of my early work was thinking about the way in which M19 integrated into the government in the 1990s. They were a rebel group that became a political party through a deal. The book suggests that a settlement that allows provisions like those that are in the current settlement with the FARC to become a political party may actually be useful for peace. So the way in which this deal is structured, allowing the FARC to come in and form this political party, may be beneficial to sustaining a deal between the government and the rebel group. I think this is an especially interesting case in which we may see this potential democracy stability trade-off happening here, though, especially because Colombia is a relatively open democracy compared to some of the other conflicts that have ended with these electoral participation provisions. And so it may be the case that allowing the rebel group to participate as a political party may not be very popular with voters. So we actually were able to do some survey work with Natalia Gabriel-Diaz, who's a graduate student here at Berkeley. We have a paper called Considering Concessions, in which we show that the peace process overall is more popular than particular concessions in the peace process. And both of these are more popular than when you actually say that the FARC will be signing on to or has endorsed a particular part of the deal. Right? Maybe not so surprising, but that these particular concessions especially may be unpopular with voters. We do, however, think that a divided elite may be driving some of the resistance to having this rebel group political party. That it's not necessarily the case that that's going to be true in every other situation. And so we're doing some new work on the role of elite queuing in Colombia. We have a survey that's actually going into the field tomorrow that's experimentally testing these electoral cues and whether or not having elites back or oppose a particular provision makes it more or less popular with different voters. We also have some descriptive evidence that suggests that this is the case in a recent issue of Daedalus that's just out with Miguel Garcia Sanchez, a frequent collaborator of mine at Los Andes. We also are hoping to do some other experimental work on this. So I'd be especially interested in your questions and comments on Colombia, but also any on the book project as a whole. Thank you very much for your time.